Hello, friends. Today I attended a fascinating webinar entitled Healing Generational Trauma. There were two teachers on the webinar. One was Dr. Diane Poole-Heller, a therapist, author, and leading expert in adult attachment theory and models, trauma resolution, and integrative healing. The other was Rabbi Dr. Tirza Firestone. Rabbi Tirza, a dear friend, came to Beth Chaim several years ago to speak to us about her important book about ancestral trauma and healing called Wounds into Wisdom. They spoke about how we carry generational trauma in our DNA, in our very beings. Rabbi Tirza spoke about the trauma she inherited directly from her parents. Her mother was a German Jew who escaped from Germany in the 11th hour in 1939, just before the war started, and landed, fortunately, in Detroit, Michigan. It was there she met the man she would marry, an American GI who soon thereafter was sent to Germany. He was involved in liberating concentration camps, including Bergen-Belsen and others. He witnessed firsthand the worst horrors of the Shoah. Her mother was deeply scarred by the deaths of aunts, uncles, cousins, and the vast majority of her family. Tirza's parents never spoke about their experiences, their losses, with her and her siblings, but the trauma was felt in so many unconscious ways. The children were profoundly aware of the heaviness, the psychic burden that was being passed on to them, even though they had no direct experience of this trauma. She went on to speak about a patient, a 10-year-old boy whose family had escaped from Europe during the Second World War. His grandparents had experienced terrible hunger and starvation. He had actually never even heard these stories, but he never left the house without his backpack in which he carried food and snacks. Though he was fully nourished, he carried the generational trauma of the starvation that his grandparents had experienced. I was reminded that when I was in high school, I had a friend who was a child of survivors. Her father, who had been exposed to unimaginable horrors in the camps, suffered from extreme migraine headaches. Several times a year, his migraines would get so bad that he would have to be hospitalized. Sadly, my friend, his daughter, suffered from the same extreme migraines. She too had to be hospitalized repeatedly. Now, her father never spoke about his experiences in the Shoah, not even to his own family. When my friend was in college, he finally decided, with the help of friends and therapists, to begin speaking about his experiences during the war. Shortly after he began lecturing and sharing his terrible experiences, he noticed that his migraines no longer recurred. In fact, to my knowledge, he never suffered another migraine in his life. To the amazement of our circle of friends, after he began sharing his experiences, his daughter, our friend, never suffered another migraine either. Both of the teachers on the webinar today spoke about intergenerational legacies, the influences of our ancestors that carry through time and are transferred to us without any conscious awareness. People who study trauma write that a family's painful patterns and unresolved trauma can become frozen in time, trapped in the unconscious field of a family. They noted that trauma is Greek for wound. Any deeply distressing life experience can be held and transmitted generationally. Intergenerational trauma can be understood to be unhealed residue of extreme life experiences that are transferred to future generations. The Israeli journalist Chemi Shalev speaks for so many of us when he says, quote, "I am a Jew, and there are scenes of the Holocaust that are indelibly etched into my consciousness, although I never experienced them directly." Rabbi Firestone writes, "Our family's past does not simply disappear. The painful history of our ancestors, as well as their rich cultural wisdom, intertwine within us to create the patterns of our future. Even when past trauma remains unspoken or has long been forgotten, it becomes part of us and our children, a legacy of both strength and woundedness that shapes our lives." During the webinar, Dr. Heller and Rabbi Dr. Firestone talked about some of the tools that are available to those who suffer from generational trauma. The first is called interoception, mindful self-attunement, which involves an inner focus with awareness of our own state, including subtle physical sensations. The key is to take time to pause and check in with ourselves. They spoke about the healing value of attunement to others, kinesthetic and emotional sensing of another being. As the famous trauma and addiction therapist Gabor Mate writes, attunement is the quintessential component of a larger process called attachment. Another therapeutic process the teachers discussed today is called finding the window of tolerance. They describe this as the zone of arousal in which we can function and grow, our range of resiliency in which we develop as human beings. The speakers emphasized that in treatment of generational trauma, awareness is the key. They quoted Dr. Yael Danieli, who writes, "Awareness of transmitted intergenerational trauma processes will inhibit transmission of pathology to future generations." In addressing post-traumatic growth, Rabbi Firestone said, "Extreme trauma and psychological struggles can also change a person in radically positive ways." The teachers today posed some powerful questions, including, how do we broaden our awareness to encompass the epigenetic legacies of those who came before us? What tools cultivate our prefrontal cortex, where agency, insight, and meaningful action are generated? How can mapping our ancestral trauma legacies help heal current patterns? How do we enter and exit the fertile imaginal realm with care and consciousness? The imaginal realm is understood to mean a sphere that is not less real, but more real than our so-called objective reality, and whose generative energy can change the course of events in the world. If you're interested in more information about generational trauma, I strongly encourage you to read Rabbi Dr. Tirza Firestone's book, Wounds into Wisdom. Now, in the book, she brings to life the profound impact of protracted historical trauma through the compelling narratives of Israeli terror victims, as well as Holocaust survivors, and those whose lives were marred by racial persecution and displacement. Throughout, Firestone interweaves narrative voices with neuroscientific and psychological findings, as well as relevant and inspiring Jewish teachings. In light of the events of October 7th, when so many of us were triggered by our generational trauma, this book can provide enormously helpful and healing insights that we all need at this time. Keni Ratzon, so may it be. Stay safe and be well. Shalom uvracha. Peace and blessings.